Welcome to Ames Public Library for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. I'm Megan. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. And we invite you to join us at future programs where you can learn more about topics like history and genealogy. Next Wednesday, we have a genealogy help session happening in this room starting at 6:30 p.m. So I hope you can join us for that. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to Ames Public Library's YouTube channel after the program ends. For those of you joining us online, your microphones will be muted during the presentation, so please submit any questions you might have via the chat function, which you can find a link to at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that chat to make sure your questions get shared at an appropriate time. If you get bumped out of today's Zoom event, just follow the original link to get back to us, and you'll be able to get right back in. And with that, I will hand it off to today's presenter, Lori.
Thank you, Megan. I'm Lori Osmus Kappmeyer, and I'm going to talk with you today about my experiences in researching the history of houses and their inhabitants. Take this house, for example. Have you ever driven down a street and seen a beautiful old house like this one and wondered about its history? When was it built? Who lived there? Let's see, where's my clicker?
Like it felt something.
Yeah. I'm going down, but I'm supposed to go up or down. I thought down.
Okay, try it again.
There we go. All right. As people interested in genealogy, you have probably approached houses from the opposite perspective. You may have learned about an ancestor and wondered in which house they lived. Here's some ancestors. So I'll cover that in the second part of the presentation. So the first part of the presentation will be about 40 minutes. The second part will be about 15 minutes. In this first part, one of your members, Mary Laura, asked me to talk about the research I did into the history of 7 houses in Boone, Iowa, for an ISU master's thesis that I completed in 2000. The title of my thesis, in case you can't read it in the tiny print up there, is The Queen Anne Style in Houses of Boone, Iowa, a Social and Economic Interpretation. This is what I sought to discover in my thesis. A popular 19th century philosophy was that the design of a house represented the character of those who lived there, as well as the nature of the surrounding community. The Queen Anne style was the most popular style in the U.S. during 1880 to 1910, when Boone had its greatest building boom. So how did the manifestation of that style in Boone reflect the people who chose that style and the Boone community? Much of my thesis was about design elements. Here's the table of contents, so you can see all the stuff that was in there. But one chapter included ownership histories, and that's mostly what I'm going to share with you today. But before I go into how I researched the history of these houses, I want to give you some background about myself and why I decided to do this. I have enjoyed looking at old houses since I was a child and considered becoming an architect. But I became a librarian because it allowed me to learn a lot of different things. I completed that thesis while I worked at the Iowa State University Library, and these are some of the positions I had there. I retired from there in 2018 after working there for 40 years. And the last job I had was head of the cataloging and metadata department. And although I also served as an interim associate dean during part of that time. My bachelor's degree is in history, and I have a master's degree in library science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Now I'll tell you about how that third degree came about. After coming to ISU, I continued to be interested in old houses, and I liked to walk around Boone to look at the old houses there. I liked the old houses in Ames too, but there seemed to be something special about the old houses in Boone. Let's see. So the catalog of classes at Iowa State University was full of interesting subjects, and after 15 years of being surrounded by the university, I decided to use my vacation time and take some classes in architectural history. Some university library positions require 2 master's degrees, one in a subject field. So in 1992, at the age of 37, I decided to spend 7 years going to school part-time to earn that second master's degree. ISU offered an interdisciplinary master's degree program that allowed me to take classes focusing on aspects of old houses that interested me, not just architectural history. So this is what I studied. So historic preservation, interior design history, 19th century American history, the history of Iowa, and even landscape design history. I also needed to write a thesis bringing together those areas. For my master's thesis, I wanted to write about old houses in Boone, but I needed to focus my research somehow. My favorite time period is 1870 to 1920. When I investigated the history of Boone and wrote this paper called The Building of Boone, Iowa to 1920 for that class, for my Iowa history class with Professor Dorothy Schweeder, I discovered why I found the houses of Boone so interesting. So look at the top line for Boone. One of the special things about Boone is that its population has been amazingly stable after 1920. It experienced its greatest growth during 1865 to 1920 due to the coming of the railroad in 1865. Boone was chosen as a division point for what became the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, including a roundhouse, repair shops, and offices. The railroad played a major role in Boone's economy, early rapid development, and this later stability. So look at the difference between Boone's population and Ames' population, for instance, for how rapidly Ames grew at certain times, while Boone always was around 12,000 for the last 70 years or so. You may not realize this, but Boone used to be 2 cities, and the yellow line shows Division Street, the line between them. The west side was founded in 1851 as the location of the county seat and was known as Boonesboro. The people of Boonesboro also hoped to obtain the railroad when it came through in 1865. Instead, the president of the railroad, John Blair, planned for it to come through a new town on the east, which became Boone. In this way, he and his investors could raise money from the sale of the land, but there were also issues on where to build the railroad because of engineering problems with the steep terrain west of the area. The railroad originally curved south, and so let me see if I can make this work. Aha. There it is. Okay. So here's the railroad. The railroad originally curved south like this. And so you can see it completely bypassed Boonesboro over here, probably standing in the way. And it didn't go straight west until 1901 when the Boone Viaduct was built. Let's see. So the town of Boone was platted to be large enough for 10,000 people, and people bought lots spread out all over the platted area. The animosity between Boone and Boonesboro was intense for a while, but eventually the residents voted for Boone to annex Boonesboro in 1887. Evidence of the split between the towns remains in that some of the streets that cross Division Street still don't match up. The Boone population stabilized after 1920 when the automobile began to impact the railroad industry. The stability in population had an influence on the percentage of housing units built before 1940 that still remained in 1990. According to U.S. Census data, in 1990, Boone had a higher percentage of pre-1940 housing units remaining than any other city of its size in Iowa, over 76%. So this explains why there seem to be so many old houses in Boone. There were. To predict what house styles might be expected in a particular town, it is helpful to see what percentage of housing units were built in those towns during each 10-year period up to 1940. So look at the Boone line, and between 1880 and 1909, if you add up 22%, 22%, and 11%, you get 55%. That shows that 55% of the houses in Boone built before 1940 were built during 1880 to 1909, when the Queen Anne style was one of the most popular styles in many other locations. And now you look at Ames and you see there's a big bunch of houses that were built from 1920 to 1929, when the Craftsman style or Colonial Revival or a Tudor revival styles were popular, and that's why you see a lot of those among the older houses in Ames, and fewer houses from before that 1900 time period in Ames. So if someone was interested in studying houses built between 1880 and 1909, Boone should be one of the best cities of its size in Iowa to study, because as of 1990, it had a high percentage of houses built during that time period that were still around. You're probably wondering what is meant by the Queen Anne style. It features details shown on this slide. It would have these houses have a dominant front-facing gable, an asymmetrical shape, patterned shingles, steep roofs, and bay windows. And on the left side, you can see some variations in how those design elements were used in houses. The style originated in England during the 1870s, when the name primarily referred to red brick buildings with white trim. And this was regarded as a revival of a style common during the reign of Queen Anne, 1702 to 1714. Between 1880 and 1909, the people of Boone built houses in other styles besides Queen Anne. So these are some examples of other styles of houses in Boone that were not Queen Anne. The top left one is called Italianate, and it has a flatter hipped roof and more symmetrical, tall, thin windows. And the other styles, other three pictures are colonial revival type styles, which usually are boxier designs with more symmetrical window arrangements and shapes and lots of columns and things. Let's see. Okay, so with over 2,000 old houses in Boone, my dilemma was how to pick a few to study. My biggest breakthrough was when a librarian at the Erickson Public Library, who is here today, Barb Reardon, yay, introduced me to a newspaper supplement from 1910 reprinted by the Boone County Historical Society. And one of its features was photographs of 47 sightly residences of Boone. And I decided it would be helpful to find these houses and photograph them so I could see how they had changed. I was looking for houses that had retained most of their original features. The newspaper supplement provided the names of the homeowners in 1910, but not their addresses. Actually, that was pretty good because the old Boone City directories didn't have street indexes, so having the names of the homeowners enabled me to find the houses much more easily. And although I recognized some of the houses from my walks around Boone, I did find many of the other addresses by looking up the homeowners' names in the 1911 Boone City directory. And then being a librarian, I had to use note cards. So I put the pictures and their addresses on note cards and organized them by address. Okay, so what would I do with them next? So here I am with my note cards and a map of Boone at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning, about to look for the sightly residents of Boone, with the help of my friend Bob Kappmeyer, who was an amateur photographer. And Bob said early morning was a sweet spot for lighting, plus it limited people seeing us and wondering what we were doing, because we looked very interesting walking around Boone taking pictures. And then Bob later became my husband, so that's why I'm Lori Osmus Kappmeyer. So we found 38 houses still in existence out of the 47 and photographed them in black and white as close as possible to their original angle. Many were greatly modified from their original appearance. Like this one is hardly recognizable, right? For example, this one was on a corner and had its front door moved to a different side of the house, so even its address had changed. These photographs were not the only factor in choosing which houses to study. Every state has a State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, that has an important role in the process of considering properties for the National Register of Historic Places. So these are the criteria for properties to be added to the National Register. Basically, to be added to the National Register, a building needs to be significant in some way, important to architecture or history. Buildings on the National Register do not have any special protections unless they receive federal funds. I visited the Iowa SHPO, which is in the State Historical Building, and looked at their records of Boone buildings that had some potential historic interest. There had been a survey project in the 1970s that identified 121 Boone houses, so I also looked at them. There were 4 Boone houses on the National Register in 1999, all of them selected for architectural significance. The house on my title slide was the first in 1988. Its nomination form listed comparable properties, and you just saw one of them, the Duncan Grant House, that had greatly changed, and this was true of some of the others as well. Also, I found that the address of the Lutz house was actually on Story Street and not on Crawford, which is where Dr. Lutz had lived previously. Besides another house that you will see later, these were the other 2 houses on the National Register. No Boone houses have been added since 1995. I observed that many of the most interesting houses were also the homes of prominent citizens, so I checked old city directories for bolded entries, which usually represented people with businesses to advertise. The earliest Boone City directory available in good condition with street addresses as they are now was 1900 to 01. So I looked at bolded entries in that one, as well as the 1911 one, to find the names of prominent citizens who had remained in the same house for those 10 years. So these pages show Charles A. Anderson, merchant tailor in 1901 and 1911. And you saw his house in my second and third slide, and you will see it again. In the end, I visited the sites of 258 houses in Boone during 1999 and photographed 92 of them with the help of my friend Bob. I kept track of them on spreadsheets like this. The spreadsheet showed the house addresses, owners in 1901 and 1911, occupations, house styles, sources, weather photographed, and the condition of the house. I decided to limit my study to one style in order to have a clear basis of comparison. To explore the Queen Anne style in Boone, I decided to choose the best examples of that style among Boone houses, which seemed to have most of their original exterior elements and were in good condition. This is the final list and why they were chosen. In naming the houses, it is customary to use the name of the first owner or the person most associated with the house. So I will refer to these houses according to the names of their first owners. That one that says CIRALG illustration, that was that survey project that I found out about at the State Historical Preservation Office. And the CIRLG stands for Central Iowa Regional Association of Local Governments. And the top one, the Folsom House, the national significance reason is because it depended on the outcome of research into its first owners, because its first owners might have had some national prominence. Okay. Now here is what you came to find out, and it's on the handout that's over there that's by the door too. How did I learn who were the first owners as well as the later residents of each house? Okay, you can see how city directories were helpful. An index by street index is helpful if you only know the address and want to find out who lived there. The earliest Boone City directories did not have street indexes, so I had to make my own by cutting up photocopies of the entries and organizing them by street in order to find out who lived in some houses. For my social and economic study of Boone, this also helped me see the variety of people who lived in certain neighborhoods and their occupations. And keep in mind that city directories list who lived in a house, not necessarily who owned the house. And also be aware that street numbering may change, which happened twice in Boone. Property tax records are good for finding out who lived in a house recently, but they do not go back very far in time. I asked the Boone County Assessor's Office if they have any historic records, and they said that what you can see online is all that they have. Property tax records also give construction dates, but I found that they are not always accurate. The ultimate source of homeownership history is the abstract of title for a property, although it will list residents. It will not necessarily list residents, but it will list the owners. Let's see, it also covers land and not necessarily buildings, and so it can require some investigation to determine when a building was added to a property. And Iowa is one of the only 2 states that still requires paper abstracts of title. So if you're doing research in another state, you might not be able to find a paper abstract of title. Okay, the houses studied were spread out across Boone. Since many of the Boone lots were available for purchase all at once in 1865, it was not clear at first where the wealthy part of town would be. I'm going to sit down now. The result is that in the early days of Boone, there was no one area where all the wealthy people lived. Coal miners and other laborers lived next to merchants, doctors, and bankers. However, nowadays you might say that South Story Street in Boone is where some of the nicer houses can be found. Okay. Here is a summary of when the houses were built in order from newest to oldest. The table also shows how many people owned them before and after my 1999 study, and the main sources I used for ownership information. I also interviewed the people who lived in these 7 houses in 1999 and photographed the interiors with their cooperation. Notice that 3 houses have had 0 new owners since 1999, which means that the people I met in 1999 still live there 26 years later, according to the property tax records. Some homeowners did not have their abstract of title, so I had to rely on city directories for those houses. My title abstractor told me that this is because 30 years ago, some mortgage companies and banks kept the abstract of title until the mortgage was paid off. To find more detailed information about what kind of people the early homeowners were, these were the other sources I used, and you have a handout over there that has all of this listed, and as well as what's now available online. So there were 3 sources on Boone history and biography that were published in 1880, 1902, and 1914. And cemetery indexes were useful for death dates if I wondered what happened to a longtime resident. And Boone newspapers and trail tales had articles on some individuals. I did not pursue family histories except for one unusual situation where a homeowner seemed to be related to a famous person. For the houses themselves, the city directories and property tax records were useful, as well as the newspaper supplement showing the sightly residence of Boone in 1910. National Register nomination forms described some of the houses in detail. The 1896 plat book of Boone County showed the shapes of the houses on the lots at that time, which helped me determine whether a house had been changed or moved or replaced with something else. So now I am going to cover the 7 houses, starting with the one with the simplest ownership history, ending with the one that is most complex. So let's look at who owned the 7 houses, and you can see if you recognize any of the houses from your visits to Boone. Okay, the Anderson house, built in 1900, has had few owners. One reason that it is in excellent condition. The original owners, Charles and Amanda Anderson, lived there for 50 years, more than 50 years, the longest of all the homeowners in the study in 1999. Charles and his wife died in the 1950s. My main published source on this house was the city directories and the Linwood Cemetery Index for the death dates. The 1999 owner, Kevin Majors, had a letter dated 1899 from the builder saying that he would custom build the house according to plans Mr. Anderson had specified. Charles Anderson was a partner in Thorson and Anderson Merchant Tailors. His partner, Peter Thorson, lived in a smaller, plainer house on Monona Street. The next owners, Harold and Helen Ferguson, owned Fergie's Grocery and Market before Fairway. After 20 years in the house, they sold it to Thomas and Connie Mylenbush. Thomas was a railroad engineer. Kevin Majors, the owner of a concrete contracting firm, bought the house in 1987. He died in 2023, and the house was sold again, but the house has had only 5 owners in 125 years. Okay. Oops, back. Sorry. Of the houses in this study, the Crow House had the fewest owners as of 1999. The original owners and family, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the next owners. It was also the only house in the study that was used for a purpose other than living space. The property tax record said the house was built in 1900, but a newspaper article said the Crows celebrated their silver wedding anniversary in this new house in 1898. And here are the Crows. According to the 1902 biographical record of Boone County, William and Elizabeth Crow had 11 children who survived into adulthood, born between 1873 and 1896, which was probably why they needed this large house. William Crow was the president and general manager of the Crow Coal Mining Company. which he organized with his brothers in 1900 after first being a partner in the coal trade with others in Boone. He had immigrated from Scotland in 1866 and came to Boone in 1876. His company had an important role in developing coal mines in the area, and he employed more men in coal mining in Boone than any other person in his time. In 1888, William Crowe returned to Scotland to visit his family and decided to build a house modeled after houses he saw there, which were no doubt in the Queen Anne style. The Crowes died in 1923 and 1932, and the house was inherited by their children. The Crowes were Baptists, but in 1936, their house was sold to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was dedicated as the first Mormon chapel in the state in 1937, according to a newspaper account. When the church members built a new church in Boone in 1976, they sold the house to Dwayne and Cheryl Lamb, who were not members of that church. The Lambs needed to do some remodeling to return the house to use as a residence, like adding bathtubs to the bathrooms. And it had two more owners since the Lambs, so a total of 5 now, like the Anderson house. The house appeared among the sightly residences of Boone in 1910. The neighborhood around the Crowe house was fairly vacant in 1900 because the area was still recovering from the stigma of being close to Division Street, the dividing line between former Boonesboro and its rival city. No one had a domestic servant, not even poor Mrs. Crowe with 11 children, and the neighborhood had the usual mix of social classes prevalent in Boone. The Rickenberg house was not spared from being converted into apartments and a boarding house during its history, but 1987 to 2021 owners Mike and Gayla Harkin put great efforts into restoring it and enabled it to become the first house in Boone added to the National Register in 1988. The house was built in 1898 by John H. Rickenberg, a successful Boone merchant whose department store stayed in his family for 90 years. He liked to describe himself as a self-made man, according to the 1902 biographical record of Boone County. Trail Tales also published an article about his life. He was born in Germany, but his parents immigrated to Boone with their 6 children in 1867 when he was 5. His father worked for the railroad as a stationary engineer. John began his career in a dry goods store at the age of 14 and bought the store in 1882. The Rickenbergs had no children, but the store was run by his wife's nephew and grandniece until 1973. The Rickensburgs died in the 1940s. The house was next owned by George and Elvira Lamb until 1962. Modifications to the house were made by the later owners during 1962 to 1986 when the Harkins bought it. It was one of the sightly residences of Boone in 1910. The neighborhood was a mixture of occupations and social classes in 1900 and 1911, as many Boone neighborhoods were. The Rickenbergs were the only family on the block to have a live-in domestic servant. The Lutz house was built in 1906 according to the property tax record, and that's accurate because the Lutzes first appeared at that address in the 1907 city directory. Information about the owners was taken from city directories because the abstract of title was not available for review. Little is known about Ira Lutz except that he was a dentist. There was an old-time dental chair in the basement of the house, but Dr. Lutz's office was in the Boone National Bank building. From 1913 to 1923, the family living there was headed by Fred Payne, who worked with his father in a livery business at 7th and Keeler. More is known about him because he had a biography in Goldthwaite's 1914 History of Boone County. His parents came to Boone County in 1850, and he was born there in 1870. His early career involved mercantile work. In 1895, he married Litha Hauser, a native of Boone. He said his father built the finest livery barn in Boone, and Samuel, its 4 sons, joined him in the business and continued it after he died. Fred described his house as, quote, a hospitable home whose good cheer is enjoyed by their many friends, unquote. He was active in Democratic Party politics. He and his wife died in the 1920s. There were various other residents, according to the city directory, but without access to the property abstract, it is unclear whether they were also owners. These included a lawyer, a chiropractor, and a railroad fireman until the house was bought in the 1940s by Kenneth Collis, a dentist like the original owner. He died in the 1970s, but his wife, Blanche, remained in the house until 1993, When Jerry and Mary Jo Menser bought the house, the Mensers made great efforts to restore it to its original appearance, as can be seen by comparing their house in 1999 with how it had compared in the sightly residence of Boone in 1910 when it was only 4 years old. Whoa. Sorry. Now organize my notes here. Okay. The Foster House was built around the same time as the Rickenberg and Crow houses in 1898, according to the property tax record. The abstract of title showed that Willard and Mary Foster became owners of the property in 1892 and lived there until 1932. A different shaped house was shown on the 1896 plat map. So I don't know who. Well, this is a problem. I knew I would do that. I knew I would do that. Can you hear me still? Okay. I think my little thing fell down here. Hello. All right. So I wanted to point out that that little house there is a different shape than the house that was built there in 1898. So it was on that property as early as 1885, so it was either moved or torn down. As you can see on this plat map, few other houses were located near this house, possibly because it's another one that was close to Division Street. In 1896, the property at 603 Harrison was at the crossroads of Boone Transportation, with a streetcar line passing by on 6th Street and 2 railroad lines within a block on either side, with the depot of one across the alley from the backyard. You can imagine it must have been rather noisy at times to have trains crossing and a streetcar line going by. You can see in the 1999 photo that the house is still at a crossroads, but this time of many electric wires. According to Goldthwaite's History of Boone County, Willard Foster spent the longest part of his career as the owner of a feed and coal business on 10th Street. Like John Rickenberg, who had a similar style of house, he liked to describe himself as a self-made man. He had been a farmer, he worked in the railroad shops, and for 10 years he worked in the streetcar service. How convenient with the streetcar going by his house. Later, he was elected as township constable and then served as county sheriff for 5 years. Willard Foster was very proud of his home. The 1914 History of Boone County said, quote, "Evidence of his success is his fine home, which is one of the modern residences of Boone. It is attractively furnished and moreover is the abode of a warm-hearted hospitality, which makes it the center of a cultured social circle," unquote. The Fosters lived in the house the longest, 44 years, but Elmer and Leon Pieper lived there for 26 years during 1958 to 1984. The current owners, Ross and Maureen Welterlin, bought the house in 1993, so have been there for 32 years. In 1999, one of their young children told me that she enjoyed living in a princess house. The various owners have worked in occupations ranging from drivers and railroad employees to salesmen and high school teachers. The house was never converted to apartments, which may account for its well-preserved condition. Okay. Like the Rickenberg House, the Barclay House is also on the National Register, added in 1995. So this was the last of the 4 Boone houses that were added to the National Register. And now you've seen all 4 of them. David and Rosella Hansen, who passed ownership to Mark and Shailene McDermott in 1999, told me that they thought it had remained in excellent condition. Why? Because it had few owners and they had never turned it into apartments. The property abstract was in transition during 1999 due to the sale of the house, but the Hansons and other sources gave me plenty of information. The ownership history of this house became one of the more complex ones after 1999. The house was built in 1893 by Alonzo Barclay, who had biographies in both the 1902 Biographical Record of Boone County and Goldthwaite's 1914 History of Boone County. He was a prominent citizen of Boone who was one of the organizers of the Boone County Bank and served as its president from 1890 to 1911. He was born in Lynn County in 1842, and his parents settled on a farm near Boonesboro in 1856. In 1862, he joined the Army and was wounded and taken prisoner in 1864. He never regained full use of his right arm. When he returned home, he attended Cornell College until the death of his father in 1866, which was also the year that he married Henrietta Trickey. He was elected county recorder in 1867, which led him to become interested in real estate, and eventually he worked as a land agent. He became involved in banking starting in 1884. In addition to being a bank president, in 1891, he organized the Boone County Telephone Company and started the first telephone exchange in Boone County. His first wife died in 1889, but in 1891, he married Flora Spencer, a teacher at Boone High School. Flora came to Boone in 1887 after teaching in Indiana, where she graduated from normal school in 1880. She was born in 1860 and grew up in Waukon, Iowa. Flora encouraged Alonzo's involvement in politics, and he served 2 terms on the Boone City Council and 2 terms in the Iowa House of Representatives. Flora was active in women's clubs and boards and was one of the few women to have her own biography given in the 1902 book of Boone County Biographies. She was a member of the Erickson Public Library Board for 40 years and served as its president for 28 years. Their house was described in the 1902 biographical record of Boone County as, quote, a haven of rest to them and a magnet which attracts a large coterie of pleasant friends, unquote. Alonzo died suddenly of a heart attack in his home in 1922, and Flora remained there until her death in 1941. They had no children, but Flora's nephew inherited the house. The next owners, Arnold and Cora Watry, lived there until 1977 and built the 4-room Capri Hotel behind the house in 1951 to capitalize on its location on the Lincoln Highway, which was part of 4th Street during 1927 and 1965. The Hansons sold the motel separately, and both they and the McDermotts operated the house as a bed and breakfast at times. But now it gets complicated. As shown in the most recent property tax records, the house has had almost as many owners since 1999 as in its first 100 years, and some seem to be apartment companies. National Register designation does not prevent modifications to buildings that receive no federal funds. The house was one of the sightly residences of Boone in 1910. The corner where the Barclay House is located was an elite part of Boone during 1900 and 1911. The Barclay House was one of the largest houses in the area. Okay. And now we have reached the last Boone house. The Folsom House has had the most complex history of ownership of all the houses studied. Fortunately, the abstract of title was available, but the portion between 1883 and 1911 would require legal knowledge to interpret fully. I'm going to show you that first, and then I'm going to go back. There, look at that first. So there's all kinds of stuff going on here. So there were 3 lots involved in the property abstract that were further divided in parts and changed hands many times. The abstract showed that James Folsom purchased one of the lots in 1868 and built a house there that had the address of 615 10th Street. I'm going to go back and show you where that little house was and try not to make a mess. Okay. So right there is the house that was first built on these 3 lots right here. That was 615 10th Street. Okay. That house could have been built around 1870. The property tax record for the house at 1004 Carroll, which is the house on the corner, stated that it was built in 1870, but that style of house was not yet being built in the United States at that point. The abstracts show that a Mary Folsom acquired a mortgage on the land on which the house was built on April 8th, 1880, and the April 14th, 1880 Boone County Democrat reported that a house was being built in that area, considered to be an unusual place to build a house near the railroad tracks, mills, and elevators. When the house at 1004 Carroll was new, there were only 2 other houses in that block, taking into account changes in addresses in the 1885 to 86 Boone City Directory. The interior details of the house were consistent with the decoration of the 1880s, having a sunflower theme, which is why I really think this house was built in 1880 and not 1870. In the cases of other houses that I studied, I did not delve into family genealogy of the owners, but James Folsom was an exception due to a possible link with a famous person, and the confusing nature of records about him. So if I just believed what I read in the 1880 history of Boone County, it would be like all the other people. I would just take at face value everything that was there on that page. But then when I started investigating, I found conflicting information. So I think he really was born in New York State, although there was an Army record that said he was born in Canada. He died when the description of his death was came out. It said he was 52 in 1892, but here this says that he was born in 1843. So I don't know which is true. In the 1870 census, he was a passenger conductor in Boone, living with his mother and some of his siblings, but he didn't have a wife yet. So that doesn't make sense that he married Sarah in 1863, and she died in 1874. And where was she if they got married in 1863? His mother, Margaret, had been born in England, and his father, Zimri Allen Folsom, had a homestead in Minnesota at the time that his wife, Margaret, was living with their children in Boone. James served in the Army 1862 to 1865 and was taken prisoner in 1863 and held 8 months. So that's another thing that makes me wonder, well, how did he get married in 1863 if he was in the Army and was taken prisoner? The prisoner of love. The 1880 history of Boone County says he married Sarah McGonigal of Pennsylvania in 1863, but another source says Sarah was born in 1849, so she would have been only 14 then, and James was in the Army. Another source says they married in 1873, which makes more sense. Unfortunately, she died in 1874 after having a daughter who died soon after her. The death date on her tombstone is hard to read and has been transcribed as 1871, so they don't even know when she died. James remarried in 1879 to someone whose name has been given as Minnie Stone or Mary May Stein, but what was consistent is that she was from Fort Dodge. But James also had a sister named Mary. So who was the Mary who took out the mortgage to build the house at 1004 Carroll? We think it was his wife, but what if it was his sister? We don't know. James became a dealer in butter and eggs and also an agent for the Schlitz Brewing Company. He was prominent in the community, evidenced by a stellar group of Boone dignitaries involved in his funeral when he died in 1892. As reported in a Boone News Republican issue that was available only at the State Historical Society Library and has not yet been digitized. That article was in a 21 years ago today section, but I could not find an obituary for him. All right. So the Folsoms appeared to have financial difficulties, and the house at 1004 Carroll was frequently remortgaged. It was even sold on the courthouse steps at one point. James' sister Emma was married to a prominent Boone attorney named A.J. Holmes, who bought the house in 1885 in order to help out the family, but he didn't live there. The Boone house belonging to A.J. Holmes was one of the 4 Boone houses on the National Register of Historic Places, at the Perigo Holmes house at 721 Carroll. A 1902 obituary for A.J. Holmes said that his wife Emma was a cousin of President Grover Cleveland's wife, whose maiden name was Frances Folsom. So this would also make James Folsom a cousin of Mrs. Cleveland. The curator of the Mamie Eisenhower birthplace, Larry Adams, was intrigued that Boone might have another connection to a first lady, but research that both he and I did could not find the link between the Boone Folsoms and Mrs. Cleveland. Even checking the most extensive information now available in Ancestry.com, I could not find a connection. After James Folsom died, the Boone News Republican said his wife Mary closed the grocery business and moved to Kansas with their 2 young children. She remarried but died in 1902 at the age of 42. The next owner of the house was Hugh Kahn, who had a coal, wood, and ice business similar to Willard Foster. He lived there 1892 to 1907 and was described in Goldthwaite's History of Boone County as someone who immigrated from Ireland in 1865 and was of Scotch-Irish descent. The house first experienced long stability of ownership during 1911 to 1934, when George Emer, a railroad engineer, lived there with his wife and 6 children. In 1934, the house was sold to John and Estella Harris, who turned it into the Harris Apartments, which it remained until 1973. Owners since then have worked on restoring it, including Steve and Cindy Capellen, who bought it in 1983, and they still own it, going on 42 years now. So you have this handout. In red, you can see all the things that are now available online that I only had available to me in print in 1999. And the only things that were not available online now were the abstracts of title, the earliest Boone City directories, and that newspaper supplement that showed the sightly residences. So isn't that cool? You can find all of that other stuff online now. So what did I learn from my research? This is what I sought to discover in my thesis. How did the manifestation of the Queen Anne style in Boone reflect the people who chose that style in the Boone community? My thesis covered a lot more than the ownership histories that I've summarized for you, so it may not be clear how I reached my conclusions. So beware. So these are my summary of my thesis findings. Boone home builders of 1880 to 1910 preferred houses with more colonial elements, not the full Queen Anne style. So you saw some pictures of some of those other houses earlier. There was conformity in housing due to moderation in income levels. There was a mixture of social classes in most neighborhoods. There was a desire to stay within the standards of taste set by the town's social leaders. It was more socially acceptable to have a large plain house than a highly ornamented one. And simple straight lines are associated with machines, a way in which the dominance of railroads in Boone might have been expressed. My thesis is available in the ISU digital repository for free, and you would just search for the first part of the title and you could easily find it. Now, part 2, which only takes 15 minutes, is going to go into the part that's probably more familiar to you in finding out in which house did my ancestors live. Okay. And I'm going to tell you how I solved 2 family mysteries. So my personal quest was to see the house where my maternal grandmother grew up. This is the wedding picture of her parents, Ernest and Marie Steinbach, in 1898. My grandmother, Ella Steinbach Gatens, talked lovingly of growing up in a big 2-story house in Joliet, Illinois, with her 7 brothers and sisters. Her father was a brewmaster. However, when he lost his job, all the older children had to quit school and go to work, and they lost the house. My grandmother only had a 6th grade education, so they must have moved soon after she turned 12 in 1914. Before 1915, did my grandmother live in a house like the ones I studied in Boone? Here's a census record for the Steinbach family in 1910. It didn't have an address, although I've heard some census records do. And my grandmother is right here, Ella, daughter, and she's 8 years old. So I used the 1902 Joliet City Directory to find the address where Ernest Steinbach lived, since there was no 1910 directory available. He lived at 111 North Center Street, and he was still there in the 1914 city directory. So I have been to Joliet to see the house, but an easier way to see what exists in any location now is to use Google Earth. So I went to the website earth.google.com and typed in the address 1011 North Center Street in the box for search Google Earth. The search will zoom in on a location from above. To see a view of the location from the street, click on this little, what did I do? Oops, oh, I went back. I need to go backwards. Sorry, revealed too much. Pretend you didn't see that. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Okay, so what I wanted to do is to point at the little man figure down here, and then the streets light up in blue where you can click and see what the street view looks like. Okay. Onwards. Okay. So I clicked on the street in front of what I thought would be my grandmother's childhood home. And this was going to be the big reveal, what it would look like. This two-story house big enough for a family of 10 that my grandmother remembered fondly. And this is what I saw. So this was very disappointing because this is not what I expected to see. So what do you think I did wrong? What from what you learned about city directories, what do you think is the issue? Anybody? Pardon me? The address changed. Yes, the address changed. So again, a librarian came to my rescue, okay? So I found out from a librarian at the Joliet Public Library that the street address has changed in 1938. And in the index of that year, it showed that 1011 North Center Street became 617 North Center Street. So now I could find out what the house really looked like. And there, it was a big two-story house, but it wasn't Queen Anne style. I don't really know what style this would be, but maybe it was colonial revival because it's sort of boxy and it has the windows are symmetrical and everything. And you know, just like that one house in Boone, the Duncan Grant house, maybe it looked gorgeous in 1900, but you know, we don't know. I'm hoping because my grandmother had such fond memories of it that it probably looked a little different than this. But I should have asked her at the time, you know, I didn't think to ask her at the time, well, where did you grow up? You know, I just assumed I would figure it out someday. So anyway, let's see. So what if your ancestor didn't live in a city house or apartment, but instead lived in a farmhouse on a farm? So there are some options for that. You can find maps of farms online. So this is from the David Rumsey collection, an 1875 Story County map where you can make out the names of different farms that were around Story County at that time. And there's another group of maps on Historic MapWorks where you can see farms in 1883 in Story County. And the ISU library has some farm directories in paper. So the top one there is Story County Farm Directory, which is actually from 1940. But before you go to the library, you probably want to make sure that if it's in special collections, that it's actually what you want to see because they're only open certain hours. And I want to mention that actually Mary Lohr and Joan Lyson and I were responsible for maintaining this online catalog along with dozens of other people over time. And so that's just part of what our job was to put those records in there. Okay. So anyway, I wanted to find the location of the farm that belonged to my maternal great-great-grandfather, John Gatens. He was the grandfather of my mother's father, Raymond Gatens, who was married to Ella Steinbach Gatens, whose childhood home we just saw. So I know the farm was in Will County, Illinois. Family story is that John Gatens was successful in the California gold rush and sent back money for the family to buy farms in Illinois. My mother would tell me this as she vaguely pointed at some farms as we drove down a street called Essington Road near Joliet, but I never knew which farm was which. So I wondered which farm was the John Gatens farm. Fortunately, I found this website when I was looking for information on Will County farms. In 1988, the Will County Historic Preservation Commission performed a survey of unincorporated rural areas documenting more than 25,000 structures and 5,000 sites dating before 1945. So, oh boy, I could finally find out where was the Gatens family farm. And I found that there were a whole group of them on Section 12 in Troy Township of Illinois, of Will County, Illinois. Now, you may wonder if you can read that, the tiny, tiny print, that they have the word Gatens, but without the S. And I think that's because there was another big farm in the Joliet area called the Caton Farm. And so there may have been some confusion over whether the Gatens farms were Caton or Gayton or whatever. But these are the Gatens farms. As far as and also it says John J. Jr., Gayton Jr. John Gatens Jr. Actually, his father was named John, but his son was also named John, and I can't find their middle names in order to distinguish them. So my California relatives, John Gayton's brother went out with him to the California Gold Rush and stayed there. And then our California relatives have gotten in touch with us and said, well, why are all of them named John? You know, how can we distinguish them all? But we don't know either. So later on, you're going to find out why the John Jr. thing is a problem. So anyway, so here's an 1893 plat map that shows that over time the Gaytons sold some of their farms or expanded some of their farms. And I heard that my great-great-grandfather really wanted to have a school, donate some of his land towards a school, but instead another farmer, Thomas Crawwell, donated his land toward the school. So the school is just north of John Gayton's farm, not where he wanted it to be. And the school was called the Troy Crawwell School. So on the 1909 map, it's clear that by that time, John Gayton's farm became the property of Charles Singh. So I wondered what the farmhouse looked like. This was written in 1988 regarding the Singh family farm. And the second paragraph says the colonial revival style house on the farm was likely built after the property was acquired by Charles Singh. So this was not John Gayton's house. And the surviving outbuildings on the site were also built by the Singh family. So doesn't it seem strange that they would get rid of all the buildings on the farm? What happened? Well, there was a problem. The family story that my mother told me had a tragic twist. Apparently, John Gaytons, who had a hot temper, had an argument in the barn with his oldest son, also named John Jr., over taking over the farm. The son's wife didn't want to stay on the farm, so John Sr. was threatening his son with a gun at the time, and the gun accidentally went off, killing his son. So I found articles about that even in Iowa newspapers at the time, although it took place in Joliet. So it was one of the sensational news stories of July 1903. Here's how the story ended. My mother said John starved himself and died at home, but the newspapers say he died in a hospital. The funeral was held at his home, however. And my grandfather's father was not the man who was killed. He was not John Jr. My grandfather's father was a different son named James. So the Singh family owned the farm for over 100 years, but sold it in 2014. So here's a last photo of the farmhouse before it was sold. And here's how the farmland looks today. You can see it's the only farmland around in this whole area of houses. Let's see, and they've torn down the farmhouse, you know, because of property tax reasons and everything, but it wasn't my great-great-grandfather's farmhouse anyway. So guess who bought the farm? The Troy School District. So let's see. So his land, John Gaytons would have been pleased that it was the Troy School District because his land might finally be used for a school after all. So after that heart-tugging story, I will try to end on a lighter note. You have seen that there are some pitfalls in using resources that might not be accurate, especially city directories. I found it interesting that when I was doing my research using the Boone City directories, there was an uproar over the inaccuracies in the one that came out in 1999, like the mayor wasn't even listed in there and stuff. This was supposedly due to computer glitches, according to the news article. I had my own experience with a surprising city directory entry. After I'd lived in Ames for 12 years and was head of a department in the ISU library, I was visiting the Joliet area and looked up a few things in the 1990 Joliet City Directory. Here is what I found. I didn't know that I had an alter ego who still lived in Joliet and worked at Burger King. What happened is that my sister Linda lived at that address, lived at 827 West Jefferson Street in an apartment building, and her mailbox was labeled L. Osmus. And I was previously listed in the city directory when I was a college student in the 1970s, and one of Linda's neighbors worked at Burger King. So you can see how things like this can happen now, and not just in the mixed up old records related to James Folsom of Boone. Even today, mistakes are being made in sources about ourselves that are going to baffle our descendants. So to review, here's how to find out who lived in a house, keeping in mind the limitations of each source. Okay. Are there any questions? Yes, Mary?
As far as
So it's not, there we go. Now it's working.
As far as you know, are any of the houses that you studied in Boone converted to apartments, or are they all still single family?
The only one that made me think it might have been converted to apartments was the Barclay House, because some apartment companies owned it. But I can't tell by looking at it that it has apartments in it. It doesn't. Oh, see, Barb knows. She lives there. She knows. Do you know any more about what has happened to that house over time? No,
Really?
not really. It's been for sale a lot is all I know.
Right. I think the last time it was bought at auction.
Okay.
Somebody that lived there, but it's kind of a recluse type.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, it's still a beautiful house though.
Is.
Yeah.
I would say of all of them, probably the interior was the most original.
Yes, and if you look at my thesis, there are photographs of the interiors of all the houses, if you want to see what they looked like inside, at least in 1999. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Oh, hold on, I'm coming.
How do you determine what architectural style a house is?
Well, there are lots of books about what the different architectural style, what the characteristics of different styles are. And so it took me some time of looking at houses. It's sort of like if you're a bird watcher, how do you determine what kind of bird it is, you know? So you look at how are the windows arranged and what kind of roof does it have? And is it asymmetrical or are things lined up? Does it have a lot of columns? Does it have, there are just certain characteristics that go with certain styles.
Is it a field guide to American houses?
Yes,
that
that's
you
a good
referenced in
one.
your-
That would be a good one,
Yeah,
yes.
that's kind of like the classic.
Pardon me?
Were they brick? What
Um,
were they built of?
Most of them were wood, but the Folsom House was brick of the 7 houses. Other questions?
A field guide to America.
Is that by McAllister?
It is by McAllister.
Yes, that's the one, that's where I took the picture of the
Mhm.
Queen Anne style. Yes, I should have given them credit, yes.
Lori, do you
Yes.
know if the bricks that were used in the Folsom House. were
Yes.
From the Boone brick.
I don't know, I never asked anybody that, but that's a good point. Well, it was from 1880, so where else would they get their bricks, huh? I don't know,
That was Boone brick.
yeah. Any other questions? Mary?
As far as you know, were there more effects on the family after that tragic death of the father shooting his son? Can you update us at all on maybe? some
Well,
things?
from what I can tell, the farm was then sold, and I was able to find the will online where in his final days, my great-great-grandfather changed his will so that his son's wife, who he was mad at because she was the one who wanted the son to leave the farm, she was removed from the will, and only the daughter was allowed to inherit their piece of the pie. And since the newspaper article said he was a prosperous farmer, you know, and made it sound like, you know, he was from a wealthy, you know, and he went to the gold rush. They had money at some point, and yet my great-grandfather and grandfather did not seem to live the high life at all, you know, and I wondered what happened to the money. And my grandfather said, well, they spent it all, you know, they took a trip to Europe and they bought fur coats and things like that, and it was all gone. And when he was a child, you know, he dropped out of school and he was kind of a ruffian and stuff. And they did not live like rich people because somehow the money had all disappeared by that time. Yeah, so it's unfortunate because my great-great-grandfather was so loved his farm. He put so much effort into acquiring his farm and really wanted to pass it on to his son. And so it was devastating for him that his son didn't want to stay there. But many people, you know, left the farm in those days too. And yet he had other sons, you know, why didn't he have James? Why didn't he have my great-grandfather become the person who ran the farm, you know? And I think it was because James didn't have the proclivity. He didn't have the talent, you know, or the interest or anything to run the farm. He was more of a mechanical kind of person than a farmer. Yeah. Other questions?
All right.
Okay,
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Lori.
hey.